Hey guys, Josh here. Welcome back to the All Out Safaris podcast, your go-to podcast for all things safari. Happy 2026, everybody. Welcome to the first episode of the year. It is just me today, and I'm going to be talking about and answering the age-old question that all aspiring photographers or amateur photographers tend to ask a lot. And it is, does your photography gear matter? Is it the photographer or is it the gear? Right? It's a question that is asked time and time again. It's a question sometimes we still ask ourselves, but we do know the answer to it. Obviously, we are not just wildlife photographers. We do portrait, wedding, and commercial photography as well. But this episode is mainly going to pertain to wildlife photography, but it applies to any kind of photography, if we're being honest. So, does your photography gear matter? And the answer is yes, but the answer is also no. But I'm going to sort of twist the question slightly and ask what matters more. Let's change that, because yes, your gear does matter. It always will. But what matters more? The gear or the photographer, right? With today's modern technology, if the camera is set up right, you can put it in the hands of someone who's never really done much photography, and they'll get photos in focus. Maybe you set up auto ISO or something for them, so the photos are also exposed properly, right? So you've got a sharp photo that's exposed correctly. But that's not necessarily what makes a good photographer, right? There's a lot of questions that you've got to ask into what makes a good photographer, but that's an episode for another day, or a question for another day. So yes, your gear does matter, but obviously as a photographer, your skill matters as well, right? And I'll tell you what matters more. The answer is, it is very clear what matters more. But if we're talking about gear for a second, right? Because people, gear these days is a bit of especially among the higher end gear, is a bit of a muchness, really, where it doesn't matter the way it used to, right? 20 years ago, you had the likes of the Nikon D300S, right? That was Nikon's flagship. That was the first camera I used back in 2014, right? It's a 12 megapixel crop sensor camera, and that was Nikon's flagship, right? It had like 20 something autofocus points, 7 frames per second. Battery life was great. Couldn't handle low light conditions. Low megapixels, can't really crop, right? Not a bad camera for its day. It was a brilliant camera. But, so if someone's using that now, a 12 megapixel 20-year-old camera versus maybe a 5-year-old camera that's 30 megapixel, can shoot 20 frames per second and can do well at 20,000 ISO, yes, so gear does matter and it doesn't, depending on what you're comparing it to, right? So, if I've got a flagship mirrorless camera and you've got a pretty average entry-level camera from 10 years ago, of course, my photos will, if I'm taking photos with both, the one with the better camera is going to come out better, right? But I will say, when it comes to gear, your camera isn't as important as what it's attached to, right? Which is the lens. Your lens far outsurpasses the importance of the lens, far outsurpasses the camera, right? I've proven it time and time again myself. I was lucky once. Someone gave me a 300mm 2.8 to test for a week in the Kruger, and I had a Nikon 200 to 500 with it, right? What's better? The 300mm 2.8. It's a prime. Prime lenses are always going to be sharper than zoom lenses. Like with portrait photography, we only shoot on primes, for example. Prime lenses among the telephoto range are incredibly expensive, right? And we don't really have a need for it. So we use Nikon 200 to 500 on a Nikon Z6 III, right? Fantastic camera. We've also got a D500, right? Also brilliant camera, right? No, those cameras are not Nikon Z9s, are not Sony A1s or Canon R5, or not necessarily R5, but R3s or R1s or whatever, right? So, but your lens is a lot more important than your camera. If I would much rather have an average camera with a great lens than a very average lens on a great camera, because then you can't really get the most out of your camera. When you got a good piece of glass on your camera, you can get the most out of your camera, right? Regardless of what camera you have, if you have a good lens, you'll be able to get the most out of your camera. If you don't have a good lens, you can't really get the most out of your camera. So yes, gear is important, but when you get better gear, it matters slightly less, right? Which it would. It's like if I'm going to race a car, right? I don't want a 1.2 liter VW Polo, right? I'm going to want a 3 liter BMW, right? For example. So yes, but then now if I go and get a 3 liter BMW and the guy next door to me also has a 3 liter BMW, it doesn't really matter as much, right? It doesn't make as much of a difference. So it's the same with gear, right? I would always recommend having decent gear if you're on a safari, especially if you're taking photos. But now, what about the photographer, right? As a photographer, I can confidently tell you, your skill as a photographer is by far, more important than the gear you're using. If you have a great camera and are a bad photographer, you're not going to necessarily get great photos. If you're a good photographer and have average gear, you can get good photos, right? Yes, you need to know how to operate the camera, and that could come with experience, but there's a lot more things that come with being a good photographer. Composition, seeing light, using light, knowing how to position yourself to the subject. Obviously, if in wildlife, right, knowing, okay, this animal's walking in that direction, I need to position my car in this way so the light is right, etc. If you're doing if you're taking photos of your friends and family, right, just at home, right, on your phone, you're going to go somewhere where the light is right, is better, right? So it's about being able to navigate the light you have, being able to have the right camera settings, being able to compose the image in a very good way. That's probably most people's weakness, right? When they're starting photography, is composition, right? You can expose your image right, and you can have a shutter speed high enough that you can freeze the motion in the image. So cool, you got a sharp photo exposed right, but now you've cut off the feet and the tail of this cheetah, or the cheetah is on the left side of the frame looking outside of the frame, but now you've got all this space to work with on the right side of the frame. So you've got to know how to compose your images. Aside from that, there's a lot of other things that go into being a good photographer, being able to see a moment, right? So yes, having good gear, does your gear matter? Yes, of course it matters, but it's not as important as the person using the gear, holding that camera. If I've sometimes been on safari with friends or with people around, and some guys have better gear than others, but guys with gear that isn't as good can still take better photos because they know how to use their gear, right? Use gear that is decent, right? That gives you the best for what you need it for. If you are just going on as a family to the Kruger National Park once a year, you don't need a $10,000 lens and a $5,000 camera. You don't. You can get something that gets you good photos and does what you want it to do. If you have the budget, cool, spend all that money. If you're someone who is a photographic guide and a safari guide, like I am, and you sell your photos, maybe you make a living from selling your photos, or maybe you get money from maybe a YouTuber, right? So if you create YouTube content, you need good good gear that can provide you with good footage from which you can make great videos. If you're doing videos, sound is even more important than the video itself, right? So there's a lot that goes into the whole argument. Is your gear important? And like I said, the answer is yes, it really is. Right? Since we've upgraded gear, I've upgraded gear over the years, you see the difference. Yes, you get better with time as a photographer, and then you start getting the most out of your gear. People also ask, when is it time to upgrade your gear? It's at the point when you're not getting the most out of your camera anymore, or when you have got the most out of your camera, but you're still not getting the results that you may want. So then you'd upgrade, right? Or you're not able to get the results with the camera you have, etc. So as a photographer, your skill far surpasses the importance of the camera you're holding. The bottom line is, right, if you have good gear and aren't a good photographer, you're not going to get photos as good as someone who is a good photographer and has pretty average gear. I'm going to say this as nice as possible, but we've been, let's say with guests on safari, and you see other people at a sighting that you're at, right? You see the gear that they're using, right? And then you see their photos afterwards, maybe posted online, and you're like, whoa, is that it? Kind of thing. I'm trying to say this as nice as possible. But then someone else will have gear that's sort of semi-professional, not this ultra-expensive professional gear, and their photos are way better. We've seen it time and time again on safari. Seen it time and time again out in the real world with photographing people. So your skill as a photographer, if I'm a photographer, I would rather invest time. There's so many resources out there that can help you, that can teach you to be a better photographer, that can give you those skills, right? You don't have to pay for courses. There's some courses that are worth buying. There are some books that may be worth buying, but there are so many resources online where you can really improve your skill as a photographer. That is far more important than going and getting that newest lens, getting that newest camera, right? If you have decent gear, right, I would always recommend now moving into the mirrorless space unless you have a flagship DSLR camera. That was flagship in the last 5 years or so, maybe 10 years, depending on the camera. If it's a Canon, let's say, 5D Mark IV, very good camera, high megapixel, good autofocus system, Nikon D850, D500, for example. A lot of guys still using those two, and it can hold its own, especially in certain circumstances, maybe not. But I was talking to a guest of ours who we're going to be hosting in the near future, is looking at upgrading their gear, taking photography more seriously. So we advise them based on their goals, based on what results they want. So gear matters depending on what you're using your gear for. But the bottom line is your skill as a photographer far surpasses the gear that you are using. Right? Invest the time, practice, right? Practice as a photographer. During COVID, right, we couldn't really travel. The amount of time I spent at home photographing my pets at home, hours, tens of hours, probably hundreds of hours over the year of lockdown there was, or 6 months of lockdown. There's so much, hundreds of hours I would have spent. The time that you spend practicing and enhancing your skill is what gives you an edge over other people, not the gear that you have. Spend the time, get better, then upgrade the gear. Your skill is more important than the gear you use. That's the bottom line. So yes, that answers the age-old question, does your photography gear matter? Is it the gear or the photographer? And the answer is both, but it is usually the photographer. People have good gear but may not have good photos, but people could have average gear but have great photos. Improve your skill as a photographer, get better, spend the time, practice, and see the difference that makes. That is it for the first episode of 2026. I hope you guys have enjoyed. I hope this has been a valuable episode to you. I know this is a question a lot of people ask. We still ask it, but that is the answer. If you guys have any queries about us, if you want to find out more, please leave a comment. You guys can reach out to us. You guys can view our website, view our socials. Reach out to us. We will get back to you. We always do. And look forward to hearing from you. And I will see you guys in the next one. Take care.